Peace be with you. Friends, how prominent a role jealousy plays in the great literature of the world. Think, for example, of Shakespeare's Iago. Think of Melville's great story, Billy Budd, which focuses on the effects of envy. Think in the Bible, the story of Joseph and his brothers. How much of that narrative is driven by envy. Or the story of Saul and David in 1 Samuel. Saul's jealousy of David drives the narrative. How often envy, jealousy is just a powerful dynamic in human relations. Well, what is it? What is jealousy? My hero, Thomas Aquinas, with typical pith, defines envy this way: an irrational anger at the success of others. That's good, isn't it? As I say, typically Aquinas there, very to the point. Envy is an irrational anger at the success of others. This calls to my mind Gore Vidal, the American novelist, I think great characterization of envy. He said, "When a friend of mine succeeds, something in me dies." Now, mind you, the subtlety of that, the honesty of it, when a friend of mine succeeds. So it's an enemy of mine or someone I don't even know, and when they succeed, I don't care. But when a friend succeeds, something in me dies. An irrational anger at the success of others. Remember in the Divine Comedy, Dante punishes the envious by having their eyelids sewn shut. The idea is they spent their whole life looking at other people, looking at how they're all doing, comparing themselves to others. So in purgatory, their eyelids are sewn shut. Now, a very close cousin of envy is ambition. And it should be clear why. If envy is an irrational anger at the success of others, one way to deal with that is by putting people down. The other way is by relentlessly putting yourself up. So if you're ambitious, you're driving yourself ahead of the pack all the time. That way you never have to face this moment of the success of someone else. I don't have to face this. I'm driving myself ahead of them all the time. So envy is a close cousin of ambition. Now, notice something. In our marvelous second reading for today, it's taken from the letter of James. Can I recommend, it's very short. Sit down, get your Bibles out, and read the letter of James. You can do it easily in one sitting. It takes you 10, 15 minutes. James is very wise when it comes to the practical affairs of the world, when it comes to affairs of the heart. James knows about that. Here's what he says. "Beloved, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every foul practice." Notice first, he links together properly jealousy and selfish ambition. They're like cousins. One implies the other, as I was saying. But where that exists, listen, there is disorder and every foul practice. The great tradition refers to envy as one of the capital sins, the deadly sins if you want, but I like capital from caput, meaning head. It means it's a kind of fountainhead of other sins and other dysfunctions. If I'm racked by jealousy, I'm racked by envy, that's going to give rise to all kinds of nasty stuff, isn't it? I'm going to start gossiping about other people. I mean, why do we gossip? Well, because we want to keep people down. We want to destroy their reputations because they might get ahead of us. It gives rise to real cruelty. You know what I'm talking about, fellow sinners. We'll do very cruel things precisely because we don't want someone getting ahead of us. We might be very aggressive, or we might be more subtle, like trying to destroy someone's reputation. Yeah, envy is a capital sin from the caput, from the head. As James says, there follows disorder and every foul practice. How about ambition? Think of all the bad things that follow from ambition. I mean, I'll step on people if I'm driven to get ahead. I'll cause havoc around me as I'm trying to climb the ladder. So from these flow all kinds of bad things. But then James makes this observation, which I think is super important. So we're talking about these objectivities of envy and jealousy and ambition and what they produce. Here's what he says, though. Where do the wars and where do conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions that make war within your members? Now he's making a further move here. So all these dysfunctions caused by envy and by ambition. But where do they come from ultimately? They come from disorders inside of us. You see, all the spiritual masters, I think, agree with this. It's when there's a disintegration inside, there tends to be disintegration on the outside. When I fall apart spiritually and psychologically on the inside, I tend to sow disorder and disintegration outside. I've used before that image of the rose window, those beautiful windows in the Gothic churches, at the center of which is always a depiction of Christ. And then wheeling around that center are all the different elements of the window connected harmoniously to each other and to the center. Okay, that's an image of the well-ordered soul, isn't it? Centered in Christ. All the elements that make me up on the inside, now linked to Christ and therefore linked harmoniously to one another. A saint is someone who's found this wholeness, this integration, which is why saints tend to radiate integration outside. They produce harmony and integration outside of them. But we sinners who have fallen apart, what does James say? There's a war within you. That's what he means. I've fallen apart. My mind, my will, my passions, my interests, they're disassociated from Christ and therefore from each other. And therefore, I become a sower of disharmony around me. That sound familiar? Fellow sinners, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you're especially in a bad way on the inside, you tend to make things worse on the outside, right? That's what he's saying. Now, in light of all of this, we have to look for the right solution. And we find it precisely in the pages of our gospel for today. Jesus is journeying with the 12, and he's clearly laying out his mission and his identity. He'll be rejected by men who will kill him, and then he will rise from the dead. In short, he's laying out the dynamics of the Paschal mystery, a life lived in self-emptying love for the sake of God's kingdom. He's implying, of course, this is their mission too. You're my disciples. Come after me. Walk in my path. And so you got that same mission by acts of self-emptying love to bring about the kingdom of God. Okay, what follows from this is a scene that would really be funny if it weren't so tragic. As he's laying out this most profound of truths, precisely about how his life is all about self-emptying love, the disciples commence to argue about what? Which one of them is the greatest? What's happening here? And we can recognize this in a family, in a coffee klatch, in a community, in a society, in a culture. What's happening here is the typical move of the envious and ambitious spirit. Who's the greatest? Which of us should get ahead? How can I put you down so I appear better? This is the old familiar game. But it is directly repugnant to what Jesus has just been talking about. His mission is about the overcoming of all this silliness and getting on with the work of love, getting on with the work of self-sacrifice for the sake of the mission. They're not listening to a word he's saying because all they're concerned about, envy, ambition, who's ahead, what do I have to do to get into that position? Okay, at which point, Jesus does something rather extraordinary. He takes a little child, and places his arms around the child and puts the child there in the midst of them. Now get that scene in your mind. The disciples all kind of gathered around Jesus, and he has his arms around this little child. And he says this, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me." It's a lot going on here. First of all, a child in Jesus' time and culture would have been at the very, very bottom of the social ladder. What I mean is a child would not have been taken seriously, would not have been seen in any way as a figure worthy of attention. You know, we're probably a little more kind of romantic about that, but they weren't in the ancient world. A child was at the very, very bottom of the social ladder. Hey, I'm ambitious. I'm envious, and so I'm ambitious. I want to get to the top. Jesus puts in their midst a figure at the very, very bottom of the social ladder. In other words, let go of this stupid envy and ambition. What else is he saying as he puts this child in their midst? I think this: children are capable of being commanded. The child isn't reaching immediately for his own autonomy. Children live in a world where their parents command them, they do what they're told, etc. Well, that's the right attitude in the spiritual order. It's not my projects, my plans, my ambitious designs. No. Do what you're told. Allow yourself to be commanded by Christ. It's not your climbing the ladder that matters. It's what you do for the sake of the kingdom. There's this too, I think. Children have this wonderful capacity, and parents know about this, to get lost in the present moment. Think of a child at play. And you know, it's something silly, but play is always kind of like that. Not thinking about the past, not preoccupied with the future, but completely caught up with a kind of joyful abandon in the present moment. Children have got that capacity. Sadly, we either kind of knock it out of them or life knocks it out of them. But little kids can do it. They can get lost in the present moment. Every spiritual master that I know talks about this in the spiritual life. What gives us joy? This capacity to give ourselves utterly to the present moment. As the little flower said, you know, what's the present demand of love? What's love demanding of me right now? That's all that matters. Don't get preoccupied with the past. Think of envy often looks to the past and what these people have done, and I resent this, and I'm still mad about that. Ambition looks to the future, right? What can I do? How can I get ahead? Where am I going? Forget the past and the future. But like a child, be able to live with a kind of beautiful, joyful abandon in the present moment. Okay, so fellow sinners, we all wrestle with envy and ambition. We all know that these inner conflicts, this disintegration on the inside produces disintegration on the outside. We all know that. We know that as we listen to Jesus all our lives talk to us about the Paschal mystery, we're preoccupied with who's getting ahead. All right, I get it. That's true. So keep this image before you. Jesus with his arms around this little child. That's what the kingdom of God is about. And God bless you. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Well, once again, good afternoon, everybody. It does my heart good to see everyone here. I thank you for the social distancing, so we're keeping ourselves safe. We're spread out. Little too cool for you today? Try wearing bishop's robes during this heat. But I thank you for coming despite the heat. This actually is one of my favorite places to come in the region. It's always so peaceful, so beautiful here. This mission, of course, is one of the most beautiful. And of course, the setting, look at it. So a joy to come up here, a joy to see all of you. And, you know, we're celebrating, as I mentioned, the Feast of the Queenship of Mary. But we're also focused today in a special way on St. Junipero Serra. And on this statue, you can see right behind me. We are gathered here today in defense of this statue. You know, I've been following this thing now for several months. The attacks on the statues of Junipero Serra. So up in San Francisco, down in Los Angeles, of course in Ventura, closer to home. Here's what's really bothered me, everybody. When I hear this language of Junipero Serra being compared to Hitler, the missions being compared to concentration camps, look, I understand, the church understands the very legitimate concerns of some of the protesters. Yes, we are concerned about racism. Yes, we're concerned about oppression. Yes, we're concerned about righting social wrongs. We're also concerned about voices from the past that have not been heard. They've been repressed. I understand all of that. But what I won't tolerate, what I don't understand, is besmirching the reputation and memory of this great saint of the church represented by this statue. I think there we have to draw the line, and we have to tell the story of Junipero Serra, because the problem is his story is being told by many others who are getting it at best only partially right. I think we have to stand with this great saint. I was privileged, it was just 5 years ago, when Pope Francis himself came to our shores. He came to Washington. And I was there for the Mass of canonization, this beautiful moment. Francis himself, there's no one on the world stage today who's a greater friend of the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor. Nobody more sensitive to the very legitimate concerns of people today. And he presided with great enthusiasm over the canonization of Junipero Serra. You know, I think, friends, what's happening is people are laying at the feet of Junipero Serra everything that bugs them about 18th century Spanish colonialism. And let's be honest, there was plenty wrong with 18th century Spanish colonialism. But in my judgment, this is not the right man to blame for those problems. And I think we need to tell his story and resist this crude characterization of him as somehow the moral equivalent of Hitler, and these beautiful missions, the equivalent of concentration camps. That's just nonsense. So let me say a few words about Junipero Serra to remind you of who this man was and what he stood for. He was born Miguel Serra, that was his original name, his baptismal name, on that beautiful island of Mallorca off the coast of Spain in 1713. So Serra would have been a slightly older contemporary of the founding fathers of our country, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, etc. He joins the Franciscan order as a young man of 16, and he took the name Junipero after brother Juniper, who was the best friend of St. Francis. He becomes a highly regarded theologian in the Franciscan order. I know some of the novices and seminarians know the name John Duns Scotus, the greatest of the Franciscan scholars. And Serra became himself a great student of Duns Scotus, a very highly regarded academic. Well-loved, well-regarded, established in his career. At the age of 35, which at that time was fairly advanced in life, he takes the extraordinary decision to leave his rather comfortable life behind and come to the New World as a missionary. You know, it's hard for us to imagine, we who hop on airplanes and we travel around the whole world in a few hours. But to leave Mallorca at his time, at the age of 35, to come to the New World meant, and he knew it, he'd never go home again. That's why Serra was unwilling even to say goodbye to his parents. You know, he couldn't face them knowing he'd never see them again. He comes across the ocean. He lands at Veracruz on the east coast of Mexico. He makes his way by foot to Mexico City. He wanted to do it in the very poor Franciscan way. And on that journey, something happened to him. Either it was a snake bite or an insect bite or something, but he got an infection in his leg, which meant that for the rest of his life, walking was always very painful for him. He covered thousands of miles on foot, and all of it in pain. He gets to Mexico City, his first stop, and here he reminds us of so many people today, his first stop was the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, to whom he was deeply devoted. He then spends about 12 years in the region north of Mexico City doing the work of the church, preaching especially. Then he goes to the missions the Jesuits had established in Baja California, worked there for many years. Finally, in his 50s, which at the time was to be a pretty old man, he made his way to our part of the world, to Alta California, and established that wonderful series of missions we know, all the way from San Diego to San Francisco. He dies in 1784, and he's buried at that beautiful mission. I'm sure a lot of you have been there, the beautiful mission in Carmel. So what do we make of this man and his work? Look, it's certainly true that the missions were often accompanied by presidios. That's true. Military and political establishments. It's also true that the Spanish military traveled with Serra as he established his missions. But here's the thing, everybody, which is eminently clear. Just the most cursory survey of the history about Junipero Serra shows. What he was interested in was not the establishment of Spanish political power. It was not the expansion of the Spanish Empire. What preoccupied Junipero Serra exclusively was the proclamation of the Christian gospel. He had in Jesus Christ what he took to be, quite correctly, as the greatest possible gift he could give. And the central preoccupation of his life was to offer this most beautiful gift to the native people of this part of the world. I refuse to accept the characterization of evangelization as some sort of cultural aggression. No, Serra wanted to share what he quite rightly took to be the most precious gift you could ever give. That's what his life was about. In 1773, Junipero Serra made his way, of course, by foot, in constant pain, from Carmel all the way to Mexico City, to argue for a Bill of Rights for the native peoples. Serra stood in a tradition going back 200 years before him to someone like Bartolomé de las Casas. When the Spaniards first arrived in the New World in places like Santo Domingo, from those earliest days, there were churchmen who were speaking up for the rights and prerogatives of the native peoples, who were resisting some of the worst elements of the Spanish occupation. Listen, even now we find those voices stirring. Junipero Serra stood in that tradition. Before we formulated a Bill of Rights on the east coast of our continent, Junipero Serra was fighting for a Bill of Rights for native people in this part of the world. A famous story, and it's reflected in the diaries and the letters. There was an attack on the mission in San Diego by some of the native peoples, burned down the mission, and one of the people they killed was one of Junipero Serra's best friends. Well, there was a great enthusiasm to put to death the perpetrators of this crime. In one of the very first vocal oppositions to capital punishment on this continent, Junipero Serra said no. Let them live that they might be saved. People who'd put to death one of his best friends. Father Tom Elowat is here today. Father Tom is the pastor down at the now Basilica of the Ventura Mission, very proud to say. But he was reminding me just before Mass, and I've come across this too in my research, more and more as the letters and diaries and other historical records of that period emerge, what becomes clear is Serra's deep commitment to the people that he was serving, his willingness to learn their language, their culture, and also what comes through is the deep affection that so many of the native peoples had for him. Again, this characterization of Serra as some agent of Spanish aggression and Spanish colonialism is just a caricature. Maybe just say a couple things about the Spanish colonial system, which nobody wants to celebrate. No one wants to bring it back. But I think it is important to emphasize, certainly true historically, that there were an awful lot of deaths. If you look at the number of native peoples who were here before the Spaniards came and then in the wake of that arrival. But it's certainly fair to observe that the overwhelming majority of those deaths were caused not by abject cruelty, but rather by disease. And I think there's a very clear consensus historically around that. There's also, friends, we have to keep in mind a distinction between the colonialism of the Spaniards and, to be frank, that of the British and the Americans that was far more brutal. You know, in 1851, the very first governor of this territory, before it was a state, basically called for a genocidal war against the native peoples. Show me his statue, I'll join you in tearing it down. But don't lay all of this at the feet of Junipero Serra. It does not belong there. And let's resist together that way too easy caricature. Just a last word, I'll bring it to close with this, about our great feast of the Queenship of Mary. The great biblical reference here, everybody, is from the book of Revelation. And we hear that image of the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. That's Mary being depicted as queen. But remember how that scene unfolds. We understand this queen is also something of a warrior because she battles the red dragon. You remember that dramatic scene in the book of Revelation? Our Lady of Guadalupe, depicted standing on the moon, referred to as the Empress of the Americas, is very much correlated to Mary in her queenly role. Now here's the thing, everybody. Yes, they're warriors if you want, but not warriors with the weapons of the world. Rather, Our Lady of Guadalupe asserts her power precisely through her identification with the poor, precisely through her compassion, precisely through the fact that she is the mother of those whom she addresses. That's how her queenly power is expressed. That's how she's the Empress of the Americas. As I mentioned, Junipero Serra had a deep devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And one of his best biographers said this: he took Our Lady of Guadalupe as his great model for evangelization. As everyone points out, La Marronita, the little brown-skinned girl, is neither Spanish nor Indian, but a mestiza. And that Sarah saw in this the model of appropriate evangelization, to bring the gift of the gospel and to introduce it into a culture in a way that allows for that mixing to take place. Can I suggest now, as we bring this to a close, that we look now not so much to the past, but look to the present and look to the future. Under the queenship of Mary, led by the Empress of the Americas, under the direction of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who inspired Junipero Serra, may we too unleash the power of the gospel, which is precisely the power of compassionate love. Let's go forth in that spirit, everybody. And that's how we best give honor to the great saint Junipero Serra. If you watch him on YouTube, he's a highly articulate man, obviously. And there's just something mesmerizing about Foucault.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director. Today we wrap up our 4-part series of discussions looking at 4 massively influential figures who together help explain our present moment, how we arrived at where we are today. Today's final figure is Michel Foucault, perhaps the least known of the 4, but he might be the one with the greatest direct impact on the way that many in our culture think today. Before we get to Foucault, though, I welcome Bishop Barron, filming now from his new diocese in Minnesota. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Thanks, Brandon. Always good to see you. It's still very warm here in Minnesota as I arrive. It's the summertime, and it's Midwestern. You know, it's heat and humidity, so I've not been used to that out in California.
Well, we got a few new books that have just been released by Word on Fire. I
Yeah.
always love to mention them here on the show. I'll mention two of them now. We'll talk about the third one at the end of the episode. Um, the two I want to mention go together because they're both about Thomas Aquinas. I'm holding them up here. The first one is Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master. This is a book by you. You wrote this a while ago, but then it's been updated, a lot of new things added, including footnotes and an index. What is this book about? Tell us about it.
That book is a somewhat more popular version of the first half of my doctoral paper. So when I wrote that many years ago in very high academic sort of jargon, I wanted to make it more accessible. And the argument of my dissertation in many ways was that Aquinas is not to be read simply as an abstract philosopher, but he's someone who's deeply in love with the Lord, and his Christology is perhaps the most important element, but often overlooked. And so what I do in that book is I take the great doctrines or teachings of Aquinas and show how they're meant to draw someone finally into a Christ-like stance. They have a spiritual and moral implication. Now, in my doctoral paper, I lay that out in great detail and with more technical language. I do it more accessibly in this book. So it was the first book I wrote when I got back from my doctoral studies. It would have been like I was writing it probably 1993, 94, something like that.
So again, beautiful new edition, hardcover, great book.
Yeah, it looks nice.
This one, along with the second one, are both part of our new Word on Fire academic imprint. We're trying to publish more serious, higher level books on theology and the spiritual life. This second one is titled Thomas Aquinas, Selected Commentaries on the New Testament. And it's edited by our own Jason Payon, who is the editor of Word on Fire Academic. It's a big, thick book. I think it runs 400 plus pages. It's a selective anthology of Thomas Aquinas' New Testament commentary. So Aquinas wasn't just a philosopher, he was a biblical theologian and wrote a lot about the Bible. It's organized to reflect especially the centrality of Christ and his commentary. So that was kind of our organizing principle. So the cool thing is that right now, if you buy Bishop Barron's book, Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master, you get the second book for free. So we normally are going to sell this for $30 eventually, but you get it for free when you order Bishop Barron's book. So I'll include a link to both of those books in the show notes, but you can find out more at wordonfire.org. Okay, let us turn now to the fourth and final discussion in our series on understanding the present moment. Again, this series was born of a talk you gave a couple years ago titled Ideas Have Consequences, the Philosophers Who Shaped Our Time. That talk was hugely popular. I think it's got almost 1 million views now, and so we wanted to
my
do
great
it.
surprise, I must say.
I agree.
I never expected that talk to be popular.
Again, I always think, we've mentioned this in the past, how early on you were advised by media consultants, keep it short, keep it punchy, lower level. People don't want long, in-depth talks, and here you are talking high-level philosophy for an hour to 1 million people.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to Foucault. We've talked about Marx, we've talked about Nietzsche, we've talked about Sartre. Michel Foucault. Before we get to his main ideas, who was this guy? What should we know about Michel Foucault?
Yeah, my memory, Brandon, when I was a student in Paris, I arrived there in 1989, and Foucault died in 1984, so just 5 years before. And, Paris is famous for restaurants and bookstores. You go around Paris, every block has got a little restaurant with great food and a bookstore. They love to feed the body and feed the mind. Well, my memory is that practically every bookstore had a photograph of Michel Foucault kind of looking out at you, He's a very distinctive looking guy. He had a bald head and kind of owlish glasses. And he was like the embodiment of the French public intellectual. Because the French, to their credit, they treat their intellectuals a bit like rock stars. They're the way we might treat sports figures. And, Foucault wrote at a super high abstract level, yet some of his books became bestsellers. Anyway, that's my memory of Foucault when I first arrived in Paris. He's born in 1926, I think it was. So, he'd be like my mother's generation. Died pretty young. He was only 58 when he died. He went through that great Parisian academic system I talked about last time in regard to Sartre. Like Sartre, went to the École Normale Supérieure, which is like the crème de la crème of French academic life. It was a few blocks away from where I lived in Paris. I used to go by it all the time, and it's on the Rue d'Ulm, the Ulm Street is where you find the École Normale. And Foucault went there, and then like Sartre too, he commences a career as a teacher. He spent a little time in Uppsala, up in Sweden. He was there on the philosophical faculty. He then begins to write in the 60s and 70s these extraordinary texts that were on issues such as the prison system, and one is called Surveillance and Punishment. He has a book on folie, madness. What constitutes madness? How is that determined by society? Then one of his last studies, L'histoire de la sexualité, the history of sexuality. What are the changing views about the morality of sex? And these books, had quite an impact, I'd say, on French cultural life. He dies, as I say, relatively young in 1984. But I've said, Brandon, I think of all the people we looked at, the most influential on the postmodern woke mentality is Michel Foucault. And I think in many ways, he sums up the three figures we looked at Marx and Nietzsche and Sartre, and kind of gives them an expression that then makes its way into American intellectual life. So Foucault had a big impact on the American universities. And, at first it probably stayed in faculty lounges, or it stayed in high-level classrooms. But in time, it's trickled down into the wider culture. And I do think if you like wokeism, then Michel Foucault's your guy. If you don't like it, he's the one that you should be blaming, I think. So whatever you say about him, massively impactful figure.
Foucault is notoriously complicated. I think beginners to his writing quickly get overwhelmed and find it obscure and difficult. But I want to talk about some of his major ideas and some of his methods. One of his methods was to traffic in what he might call the archaeology of ideas. What does this mean?
Yeah, think of an archaeological dig where you're looking at what's on the surface, but then you're digging down to the various levels of a city. And let's say, or like you remember in Rome at San Clemente, that great church, and then they dug down underneath. They found all kinds of earlier churches, and even going back to pre-Christian times and so on. So that's the image I think he has in mind, that you're looking at something on the surface today. So there's an institution, there's a way of thinking, a way of behaving, and say, oh yeah, there it is, that makes sense. But now dig down underneath it. Look at earlier forms of it. Go way back, go back centuries now. And how did people inhabit that space intellectually? So to take his famous examples, punishment, the prison systems. Who gets punished and why? What's considered criminal behavior and why? And we say, well, this, and that, and for these reasons. Okay, but now dig down. Do your archaeology. And what will you find? Well, in other ages, those things weren't considered crimes. Those things weren't punished. Or other things that we now say, oh, that's perfectly fine. Those were severely punished. Maybe the best example would be heresy. Go back to, our hero, Thomas Aquinas. I mean, one of the greatest intellectuals in the West, took it for granted that a heretic should be publicly killed. And Aquinas is no, barbaric figure. On the contrary, he was the leading intellectual of his time. Thomas More, one of my heroes too, would have taken for granted that a heretic should be burned at the stake in a public place. Foucault was very interested in that. Why today we would say, no, that's horrific. Even if we were to say, yeah, that guy's a heretic, I'm not going to recommend I burn him at the stake in a public place, right? So he's interested in what happened, what shifted around. What does that reveal? Now, do other examples. Madness. What's considered madness in one era, and that guy needs to be put away, And then today, what's considered madness, where that person needs to be put away, and they might be very different depending on the society and so on. Or then most famously, maybe the last study he did on sexuality. So we say, oh, there's the way people should behave sexually, and sure, that makes sense, and that's the right way. But yet, go way back, as he did, like to the pre-Christian times, to the classical world, you find entirely different sexual mores. who are the people that gave us the natural law? So we'd say, yeah, natural law of philosophy that we follow in terms of sexual ethics. Well, the ancient Greeks did. But yet, it seems pretty clear that ancient Greeks thought it was okay for an older man to have sex with a younger man. It was sort of just part of the way things happen. They did think there were bad expressions of sexuality, but they were for very different reasons than we would offer today. Okay, so that's the kind of thing Foucault's very interested in, is when you dig down. And then what does he find? And this is where Nietzsche comes in very strongly. He's, I think, hugely impacted by Nietzsche. Power, plays of power. Who's in charge of the society? And how are they structuring society in such a way as to maintain themselves in power? That becomes a major preoccupation of Michel Foucault. And then here's an interesting distinction, Brandon. If I get his language right, there's like coercive power, which is very obvious. So I'm going to threaten you. I'm going to fire you, or I'm going to threaten you with prison, or threaten you with death. That's coercive power. But he's more interested in what he calls, I think it's normalizing power. Meaning all those ways that subtly within a society, we structure things in such a way that they're going to behave a certain way. We just make it so that, yeah, they want to behave that way. When in point of fact, it's powerful people within that society have so structured the operation that they get people to do what they want and to think the way they want them to think. So Foucault wants to do the archaeology and then find who are the people that were kind of running the society, and what did they want, and how are they controlling people through forms of discourse, through ideology, through certain cultural practices. Now, I hope I'm just doing a very quick sort of overview of it, but I think you probably can hear a lot of the rhetoric of the woke thing today, right? So, hey, well, here's the way you should behave. Yeah, but wait a minute. You're a white man who's part of a power structure that's patriarchal, and why should I be listening to you? And you've set this thing up so that your people are going to have an easier go than my people, right? So that's how Foucault's thinking, I think, has come into the operation today. But he did, to his credit, he was not a superficial guy and did very serious kind of research into the different layers, hoping to uncover the plays of power that were operative at given moments.
Maybe the central theme of Foucault's philosophy, you've hinted at it just a couple moments ago, is the relationship between knowledge and power, or to use his jargon, modes of discourse. What's he getting at here?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. Because modes of discourse, which means the way we talk about things, the way we argue, the way we present our ideologies, can seem very innocent. I'm just here thinking the thing through and coming to my conclusions. Foucault is like the great masters of suspicion. Ricoeur used that language to describe Marx and Freud. Yeah, I know that's what's going on the surface, but what's really going on is something else. So I know that discourse you're using and that argument you're making just seems, very rational and commonsensical and obvious. But in fact, it's serving this often hidden power structure. Think here of Marx, right? Substructure, superstructure. I think that's where Marx influences Foucault. So Marx would say, yeah, on the surface, there's religion and there's the army and there's politics and there's the arts and they seem innocent enough. And they would all justify themselves in obvious ways. But then Marx says, yeah, but deep down, what's really going on is some kind of economic exploitation, right? And these things are just protecting the economic powers. Or Sigmund Freud. There's someone behaving, that makes sense on the surface. I understand what he's doing. No. What's really going on is this guy's acting out some repressed sexuality, So they tend to play the Marxist superstructure, substructure game. And I think Foucault comes into that picture too. Yeah, there's the way we organize our lives sexually, we organize our prison system, here's how we organize the process by which we institutionalize people, etc. And that all seems, rational and innocent. No, no, no. Look down deep. Do a little archaeology there, and you're going to find there's some power structure in place. It's funny, Brandon. I know you're very active in the Chesterton School and founding a Chesterton School. And I think it was the other day you sent me this beautiful picture of the books, that you're recommending, right, for the kids. And they're all these wonderful, the great books, right? And look, you and I, we love the great books. I was raised on them. And the great books go back to someone like Mortimer Adler, early part of the 20th century, who determined these are the great books. Well, if you're Freud or Marx or Michel Foucault, what do you begin to say? You say, okay, why did Mortimer Adler choose those books? And Mortimer Adler, who's a white guy, he's a Jew who had become a Marxist and then became an ardent Christian. So what's going on there? What's his agenda? What is he trying to pull here? Why would he think these are the great books and therefore the other ones aren't so great? You know what I'm saying? You can hear this is the way the woke mentality goes, but it's coming out, I think, of this Foucaultian suspicion of, so let's say in your case, well, Brandon Vaught is so suggesting with Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, and well, okay, but who is this Brandon Vaught fella, and what does he want? And well, he's a white guy, isn't he? And he's got this certain economic background, and he's coming out of a deeply Catholic perspective, and how come all the people he's recommending are white, and how come they're all Europeans, and so that manner of thinking, I think, is very conditioned by these people we've been looking at, and especially Foucault.
I can't resist at this point asking you to briefly share your encounter with Mortimer Adler now that you brought his name up, which has always, for me, been one of the funniest Bishop Barron stories.
It's a weird story. I was a kid, and I was writing my master's thesis at Catholic U, and I was writing on Karl Marx, and not because I was some ardent Marxist. I wasn't. I was trained in the classical tradition, but I wanted to learn a contemporary or a more modern thinker. So there was a professor I liked who knew that stuff. So I was writing on Marx. So I was there. It must have been a summer break or something. I was home in Chicago, and I had bought this commentary book on Marx, and in the store that day was Mortimer Adler. And I knew, oh, Mortimer Adler, it was great. And he was signing, so he had just written, remember he wrote a lot of popular books toward the end of his career. He was signing one of those. And just stupidly, naively, I get in line, and I went up to him, and I'm a kid, I didn't have any money to buy his book. And I said, I wonder, would you be willing to autograph this book? And it was a book on Marxism, And he looked at me like, what, is this a joke? And he said, should I sign it Karl Marx or Mortimer Adler? And I said, Mortimer Adler, please. So yeah, that's the one time I met him. I'm sure he was rather unimpressed by me.
Okay, let's get back to Foucault. I want to ask about the connection between Foucault and one of the other four influential figures we've been discussing, namely Friedrich Nietzsche. Both of them focus a lot on power.
Power.
We just talked about Foucault's relationship between knowledge and power, but we got Nietzsche's will to power. How do these two conceptions coincide?
Yeah, I think Foucault represents a kind of refinement of Nietzsche there. I think he's very Nietzschean in stressing power. If you bracket an objective value, if you say, look, there really isn't some pure objective truth in regard to sex or to punishment or who's crazy and who isn't. So his archaeology revealed to him, well, there's nothing objectively the case. It's just shifting cultural forms, right, and different plays of power. So therefore, the really interesting question is, who's got power and how are they exercising it and why? Who's in, who's out? Where I think Nietzsche, you've got a kind of valorization of the will to power. I think in Foucault, he's suspicious of power plays. He's not saying like, hey, great, off you go, just will to power, buddy. I think he's saying, wait a minute, who in this situation is pulling the levers and why? And he's kind of, I used that image before of the Wizard of Oz, pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz. I know these things look very impressive, but they're actually just this bozo behind the curtain pulling levers. And I think his philosophy, it's like Marx that way. He's trying to pull the curtain back on the somewhat questionable forces that are in fact operating our society. So I'd say it's a kind of refinement of Nietzsche that way.
You've pointed out how a lot of today's policing of language, of the way we talk, can be traced
Yeah.
back to Foucault. So think of things like microaggressions, trigger warnings, disguised sexism, hidden racism, homophobia, transphobia. How much of this stems from Foucault's understanding of language?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, Brandon, to ask how he'd respond to that if he were alive. I don't know, but I think there's a lot of inspiration from Foucault behind those moves because they're born of suspicion. Why am I aggressed? Well, because I know you're making this argument that just seems very, objective and rational, but in fact, what's going on is you're harming me, you're excluding me, you're putting me down. And go back to that example that I used of, the great books. Well, the natural reaction of people say, well, what do you mean? I guess my book isn't great. I guess, and the great books all seem to be written by white European males, and so I guess that means if I'm a Latina woman of color, then I guess I don't qualify to write a great book. So that instinct to look behind the surface to what are the power plays, that's a Foucaultian move. Now, has it run amok in our society? I would say yes. You know, to anticipate your question about like, what did Foucault get right, I think he got actually a lot of things right. But is it Foucault run amok today, like where there's such suspicion of everyone's claim to anything? They're like, okay, I'm sorry, Aquinas is a dead white male, but I still think he's right, about whatever. Or yes, I know Plato was a white European male, but he was right about a lot of things. I know Shakespeare, etc. So I think there is a Foucaultism run amok that we see in the wokeism today.
You've said in some ways, I think you said this at the beginning of today's conversation, that Foucault represents the summing up of all the
Yeah.
figures we've looked at in this series: Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre. How is that so?
Yeah, well, I think Marx maybe substructure, superstructure. Nietzsche is the power stuff. Sartre is the self-invention, culture and the sort of bracketing of objective moral norms, etc. I think he's got all that in him. But it was the particular focus he had that made him, I think, kind of a mesmerizing thinker for a lot of people of his generation. I think part was the way he looked, and if you watch him on YouTube, he's a highly articulate man, obviously. And there's just something mesmerizing about Foucault. And, as I suggest, Brandon, and you've asked this before, like, what do these people get right? There is a lot right there. And I think the archaeology of knowledge is not a bad thing to do. When we get a little bit too smug or a little bit too cocky or self-confident about, well, that's the way it is, and that's right, and that's wrong, and that's true, and that's false. Well, yeah. I mean, I've been the great advocate over many years of objective moral and epistemic values and all that. But can we be maybe a bit more modest about the claims we make and maybe a little more suspicious? See, maybe classical people like ourselves need to be a little more suspicious of what are power plays going on and what's really behind that language. And I'll confess I find challenging Foucault's later work on sexuality. When you look back, as I say, at the very people that gave us the natural law of morality, it's clear in the Platonic dialogues, that sex between an older man and a younger man was kind of taken for granted by the leading figures in the society. Well, how do we deal with that? And I think Foucault raises some of those questions in ways that maybe make us think a little harder about these things. And again, that's not to embrace some kind of cultural relativism, but I think it's okay when we get challenged, or that issue of who's insane and who isn't. Like, why don't we burn heretics at the stake? You and I both love Thomas More and Thomas Aquinas, the brilliant men, good, saintly men, who both took that for granted. And now we'd see that as abhorrent. Even people you and I would strongly disagree with, we're not going to drag them out in a public place and burn them alive, right? So what happened? What happened? And are those worth looking at, those examples? And I think the answer is yes.
Well, you preempted my final question, which I've asked about all these people. What did they get right? What did they get wrong?
Yeah.
You just talked a lot about what we can respect and even absorb from Foucault's thought.
Yeah, and maybe I just specify, Brandon, the modern turn, beginning with Descartes. And it's easy enough for classically minded people like ourselves to say, oh, these moderns with their subjectivism and relevant, they turned away from the objective. And there's something to that, but I come back to Lonergan here, who to me summed up the right answer. The condition for the possibility of true objectivity is a properly constituted subjectivity. And his point was, we're not just these little blank slates on which the world writes, but we're these active, involved, thinking agents, who go out to meet the world and we ask questions and we draw conclusions. And let's face it, our subjectivity can be messed up. We can be operating with weird prejudices and we can have blind spots. We can succumb to pressure. Like, oh, if you hold to that view, you're going to lose your job. And if you hold to that, they're not going to like you anymore. So Lonergan said we got to be continually calling ourselves to a conversion at the subjective level if we are to appreciate the objective for what it really is. So take someone like Foucault. Are there these plays of power sometimes that work their way into our own psyches, into our communities, into our modes of discourse? And maybe that would prompt, in a healthy way, a sort of examination of conscience epistemically. Like, boy, was I really dispassionately objective today in the way I was assessing that argument? Or was I influenced by lots of things that distorted my vision? Am I part, again, without going into wokeism, but am I part of certain modes of life that are distorting my vision of reality? Am I conditioned by people around me in such a way that I don't see things as they really are? And I think, at their best, people like Foucault, raise those questions in a healthy way.
Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. We take one question every episode. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question, just visit the website askbishopbarron.com, and there you can record it on any device. Today we hear from Michael here in my home state of Florida. He's asking about something you said in your recent discussion with Lex Friedman when defining God. So here's Michael's question.
Hello, this is Michael from Florida. Dear Bishop Barron, in your conversation with Lex Friedman, you spoke clearly at the beginning about God as being rather than as a being. But later you talked about God as the love between a father and his son. Isn't that again taking God as a mere being or two or three beings rather than as capital B being?
No, thanks for that question. We need a whole course in Trinitarian theology to really parse that out. Here's a quick way to get at it, though. When we talk about Father, Son, and Spirit, we're not talking about three beings. You're not talking about three persons in the ordinary sense of the term. Like Brandon's a person, I'm a person, and you're a person. And we have these three persons talking to each other. That's not the way to think about it. When Augustine was asked, how come we call these things persons? He said, so we have something to say when people ask us what they are. And his point was, the word person is misleading because it seems to indicate three beings. What we're talking about are three subsistent relations that obtain within the sheer unity and simplicity of God. Now, as I say, we need a whole course in the Trinity to parse all that out. The Father is the fundamental knowledge, right? That God has this sort of chthonic self-possession. The Son is the act by which the Father knows himself. He's the imago of the Father. The Spirit, as you suggest there, the love between the Father and the Son. But notice, just as my mind can engage in those three moves, right? Augustine calls it mens mind, notitia sui, self-knowledge, amor sui, self-love. The mind can do that without becoming three minds. There aren't three minds that are doing it. They're three, I don't know what they are. That's what Anselm when asked. He called them nescio quid. They're three, I don't know what they are. Aquinas called them subsistent relations, which is kind of metaphysical nonsense in a way, because the one thing a relation is not in classical thought is subsistent. But anyway, you get my point, that there are three moves within the unity and simplicity of God. So they're not three beings. So that's why there's no conflict between saying God is being itself, ipsum esse, and God is a community of three persons.
Well, thank you, Michael, for your question. I mentioned that we have 3 books to mention here in this episode, and we've covered 2 of them already, the 2 Thomas Aquinas books. The third one I don't have here in front of me, but it's a very exciting new book from Word on Fire titled The Holy Hour, Meditations for Eucharistic Adoration. This is a unique collection of hymns, poetry, prayers, and reflections for adoration, pulled from across the 2,000-year tradition of the Catholic Church, designed to draw readers more and more toward the mysterious silence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. It has an introduction by Fulton Sheen, where he talks about his emphasis on the Holy Hour, and then a foreword by Bishop Barron. It includes the Eucharistic hymns of Thomas Aquinas in both Latin and English, over 25 poems with Eucharistic resonances from saints like John Paul II, Edith Stein, John of the Cross, Teresa Lisieux, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Dante, and G.K. Chesterton. It has passages from each of the last several popes on Eucharistic adoration, passages from the Catechism, and then brief theological and spiritual reflections from Bishop Barron, but also from other heroes of Word on Fire, including Flannery O'Connor, Irenaeus, von Balthasar, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Tolkien, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and many more. So it's a very unique, special collection. If you're looking for a book to guide you in the spirituality of adoration, to bring with you to the chapel, this is the one you want. Again, it's titled The Holy Hour, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And then finally, one last bit of homework. Next time Bishop Barron and I are together, we're going to be recapping his discussion with Lex Friedman and some of the comments that were left on the video. So I want to encourage you, if you haven't listened to that discussion yet between Bishop Barron and Lex Friedman, do it now. In a couple weeks, we'll have our episode here. So you have 2 weeks to listen to it. It's a long discussion. It's about 2 hours, and it's high level. It's invigorating, but watch it, please. And then you'll be ready for our recap episode here. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Peace be with you. Friends, we come to the great feast of Christ the King, which is always the last Sunday of the liturgical year. Think of the king coming at the end of a long procession into his palace. Well, this is the Christ the King at the end of the great procession of the liturgical year. What I want to do is look at 3 dimensions of Christ's kingship, one from each of the 3 readings proposed for today. The first one has to do with David. We're looking at the second book of Samuel, a book that I spent a number of years of my life working on. I wrote a theological commentary on 2 Samuel. And we have a reference here to the time when David became king of all the tribes. So he was involved in a great civil war with the followers of Saul for a long time. David consolidated his power in the southern part of the Holy Land. But then finally the tribes from the north came to him. And here's what they said. Here we are, your bone and your flesh. Very interesting move. They weren't just saying, here we are, your subjects. Here we are willing to live under your political leadership. They acknowledged somehow they were flesh and bone with David, that they were part of his mystical body, if you want. What we see here is a theme that's basic in the Bible. The king is the one who draws the tribes together. In his person, not just through his political machinations, but in his very person, he's the one who brings the nation together. You know, the theologian Johann Adam Müller, he wrote in the early part of the 19th century, proposed an understanding of priesthood and the episcopacy and the papacy I've always found compelling. What he said was, every parish needs a single person to be the sign and effector of its unity. That's why every parish needs a pastor. And not just a pastoral team, or not just 3 or 4 that work together, but one figure who symbolizes and brings about the unity of the parish. It's also, he said, why every diocese needs a bishop, not a team of bishops, not a committee, but needs one person who in this mystical way can draw together. He sums up the unity of the whole diocese. And Myrna was writing at a time when there was a lot of controversy between Catholics and Protestants about the papacy. Why should there be this, one great monarchical ruler? So that was sort of the Protestant objection. Myrna's answer was, same principle. The whole church worldwide needs a single figure in whom they can find their unity. So prior to any particular decisions the Pope makes or a bishop or a pastor makes, there's this symbolic quality. David had it. We recognize, they said, you're bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. In you, we find our unity. Okay, now apply this, everybody, to Christ. Who is he? He's the one in whom the whole world finds its unity. When the Son of Man is lifted up on the cross, he will draw all people to himself. Mount Zion, the true pole of the earth, all the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. But through the tribes of the Lord, all the tribes of the world. I always think when I talk about these things of the great arms of Bernini's colonnade that reach out from St. Peter's, and the symbolism is very clear. They're meant to embrace the whole world. What we all say to Christ is we are bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. We are members of your mystical body. Under your kingship, we find our unity. Oh, why shouldn't the church be run by a committee? Well, we're not going to find our unity the same way. Why is there one Lord, one faith, one baptism? Same reason. We find our unity under Christ's kingship. Okay, a related theme now, coming from that second reading from Paul to the Colossians. It's a hymn of praise in many ways, this letter to the cosmic Christ. It's a beautiful theme that in Christ all things in the world are kind of drawn together. They were created by him. They were created for him. He's the Alpha. He's the Omega, that from which all things come, the one to whom all things return, and so on. But Paul also speaks in Colossians of Jesus the warrior. Now, mind you, every single king in Israel was a warrior. That's part of what it meant to be king. You did battle with the enemies of Israel. As I've said to you before, read the Bible symbolically here. Israel standing for the power of God in the world, all of its enemies standing for the power of sin. So, of course, Israelite kings did battle. Now, this could be symbolized by the Amalekites or the Philistines or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Greeks or the Romans. They symbolize opposition to God's ways. But every king of Israel is a fighter. So is Jesus. From the beginning, he's opposed. Remember, we hear that when the coming of Christ is announced, this Christ child, Herod and all of Jerusalem with him tremble in anxiety. Herod tries to stamp him out in the most brutal way possible. From the moment he appears publicly on the scene, Jesus is opposed by forces both visible and invisible, right? The visible forces come out against him, whether it's the scribes, the Pharisees, the representatives of the official religion of the time, whether it's the political authorities. The visible enemies come out to meet him, and so do the invisible enemies. From the beginning, Jesus is an exorcist. Jesus confronts the invisible powers of darkness. And then, of course, his whole life comes to a climax on the cross, where all the powers of darkness come out at him. They come after him. Here's how Paul puts it. He delivered us from the power of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. It's an extraordinary line, everybody. He's talking about God the Father here. He, the Father, delivered us from the power of darkness. That's all of us sinners, caught in our personal sin, but also in the sort of systemic sin. He sent his Son, he the Father, into God-forsakenness, into the darkness. Why? To wrest us from it. That going to be easy? Come on. That's why he was a fighting king. There'd be a battle involved because the powers of darkness and fellow sinners, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about, both personally and institutionally. The powers of darkness do not want to let us go. And so there's got to be a mano a mano. There's got to be a combat. And the Son of God entered into the lists with the powers of darkness. He went mano a mano, right? Hand-to-hand combat. Read the Gospels now under that rubric. Don't think of Jesus as some, harmless little ethical spiritual teacher from long ago. That's exactly how people today want to domesticate him, by the way. Oh yeah, a lot of different teachers and Sufi mystics and rabbis and Hindu sages, and then there's Jesus. But that's not getting this point at all. That renders him harmless. I can set him aside. No, the real Christ is a warrior. And he's come to do intense battle. Again, he delivered us from the power of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. You see, this king did battle with the king of the fallen world, wrested us from his grip, and brought us into his kingdom. You want to understand the church, by the way, up and down the ages, continuing exactly that work. Why did Jesus say, by the way, to Peter, you're Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it? That doesn't mean hell's going to come after us and we're going to be able to withstand it. No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. The gates, that's where you'd attack an enemy city. It was the weakest point. What he's saying is the gates of hell will not prevail against us. We're on the march. See, we're now the army gathered under the banner of Christ the King, and we continue to do battle with these powers, continuing to wrest people from their grip. Seminarians, priests, listen to me. That's our job. That's our job, is to enter into this struggle under the kingship of Christ. Okay, on purpose, I'm using some pretty harsh language there. Strong, warrior, battle. But now look at the gospel, and we see how really wonderfully strange this whole thing is. What do we find? Well, sounds like you're describing, Bishop, a Davidic warrior who's going to be taking out sword, or adjust the metaphor, taking out machine gun and tanks and bazookas, and is going to go after the powers of darkness. How does the Davidic king fight? He's mounted up on a Roman cross. The worst, most painful, most humiliating way to die. The clearest sign possible that you are not the Messiah of Israel, that you put to death at the hands of Israel's enemies. It looks for all the world like the powers of darkness just won. Maybe this guy put up a good show for a while, but at the end of the day, the powers of darkness did him in. That's what it looked like for all the world. What does he say from that cross? But, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. The cross is precisely the way the king fought, allowing all the darkness of the world to come at him. He absorbed it, so to speak. Listen, in the ever greater divine mercy. When we fight evil on its own terms, we lose. By that very act, we give into it. What Jesus did was he took all of the evil of the world into himself and then swallowed it up in the divine mercy that's greater than anything that's in the world. That's why the risen Jesus, when he appears to his disciples and he shows his wounds, the wounds of battle, if you want, those are the wounds of the king that went all the way in this mano a mano struggle with evil. But he showed his wounds, the signs of battle, but then he said shalom to them, peace. What he offered was a word of forgiveness. It's through nonviolence and forgiving love that Christ the King wins the battle, transfers us from the power of darkness into his own kingdom. It's in that great act that we find our unity in him. See, this is Christ the King, everybody. Take him with utter seriousness. Don't just turn that into a bland metaphor. No. He's a king in whose army we are called to fight. But then don't understand that metaphor in worldly terms, like we're going to fight with the weapons of the world. No, it's through God's self-emptying love, through God's forgiveness, that evil is conquered. And so for all of us today, the question remains. It's been the same question for the past 2,000 years. Are you going to fight in his army or not? Because as St. Ignatius saw so clearly, go through his spiritual exercises, at the end of the day, we got to join one army or the other. You join the army of the devil, you join the army of the fallen world, or you join Christ's army. That's the only decision that finally matters. So on this solemnity, on this great feast of Christ the King, let's acknowledge him, the one in whom we find our unity, the one who fought the good fight all the way down, precisely through nonviolent and forgiving love. You can join his army.